Elias Thorne had inherited the 16 acres of woods, fields, and water from his grandfather, a man who believed the greatest wealth was peace. The heart of the property was the pond, not a manicured lake, but a dark, natural bowl fed by a spring, its edges fringed with cattails and stubborn, ancient willows. For Elias, a man scarred by a quick, brutal career in city finance that had chewed him up and spit him out before he hit 40, the pond was a silent, unblinking sentinel of sanity. Every sunrise over its surface, every heron that fished its shallows was a small, daily act of reclamation. That tranquility was shattered on a Tuesday morning in late May. Elias was tying his ancient canoe to the dock, a rickety, beloved structure built by his grandfather 50 years prior when the vehicles arrived. They didn't use his gravel drive. They ripped across the newly mown field adjacent to his boundary line. First, a pristine white BMW X7, so new the dealership stickers were probably still on the windows, followed by a muddy, utilitarian pickup truck carrying two men in neon vests. The BMW stopped 50 feet from the water's edge. The driver's door opened with a muffled hydraulic sigh, and out stepped Cassandra Vance. She was an exercise in calculated, effortless wealth, designer sunglasses covering half her face, tailored linen trousers, and a crisp white shirt that looked incapable of wrinkling. She looked at the pond not with appreciation, but with the narrow, critical gaze of a project manager assessing a necessary demolition. "Can I help you?" Elias called, his voice flat. He didn't want to be sharp, but he recognized the type, the kind who saw the country as a backdrop for their curated life. Cassandra, or Cassie, as he would learn, didn't even look at him at first. She was examining a surveyor's stake hammered into the ground near the largest willow, a spot Elias knew for a fact was a good 20 feet inside his legally established line. "You must be Mr. Thorne," she finally said, turning her head just enough to acknowledge him, her voice smooth, low, and imbued with the chilling certainty of someone who had never lost an argument rooted in cost. "I am Cassandra Vance. I own the adjoining property now. She waved a hand vaguely toward the willow. "Mess of a field you've let grow. And we have a problem." The problem, as Cassie presented it, was that Elias's pond, a beloved and vital ecosystem, encroached upon her new property. She pulled a thick sheaf of legal-looking documents from a leather portfolio the color of expensive cognac. "According to my attorney," she stated, not asking, but informing, the property line was inaccurately surveyed in the late 70s. "We have commissioned a new, certified survey that clearly shows this willow and a significant portion of the pond's northern inlet, about 25 feet in all, falls within my riparian rights." Elias walked slowly toward her, his grandfather's old faded baseball cap pulled low, shading eyes that were beginning to narrow dangerously. "Riparian rights," he repeated, the phrase tasting like city sewage in his mouth. "Mrs. Vance, that pond has been in my family since 1952. The deeds are clear. The fence line has been consistent for decades. Custom doesn't supersede legality." "Mr. Thorne," Cassie replied, sliding the sunglasses onto her sleek, dark hair, revealing sharp, beautiful eyes that held zero warmth. "The bank is eroding. Your dock is an eyesore and structurally unsound. My plan is to landscape that entire northern boundary, put in a crushed stone path, and, frankly, clean up this stagnant water feature. It's spoiling the view from my patio." The word stagnant was like a match strike. That stagnant water feature is home to bass, turtles, and a pair of nesting wood ducks. It's a natural spring-fed pond, and it is mine. Correction? Cassie leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to a theatrical intensity. "Your attorney will receive a formal letter of intent this afternoon. Consider this your polite one-time notification. You have 30 days to dismantle the dock and remove all personal property from the disputed zone, or we will begin abatement at your cost." She glanced at the BMW, then back at him, the implied threat. "My lawyer is better. My money is bigger," hanging heavy in the humid air. The men in vests, ignoring the owner of the pond, began hammering a new set of stakes deeper into the soft, springy earth barely 3 feet from the water, Elias did not raise his voice. He took a deep, centering breath, smelling the fertile earth and the damp, cool scent of the water. "Mrs. Vance, I advise you to tell your surveyors to step back from the bank. That ground is unstable, especially after the rain last week. And I advise you to tell your lawyer that I didn't come back to the country to fold when a rich predator shows up looking for a trophy." A thin, dismissive smile touched Cassie's lips. "Duly noted, Mr. Thorne. I'll send you the bill for the stakes when this is over." The next few weeks were a relentless assault. Cassie's attorney, a sleek, merciless pit bull named Julian, peppered Elias with filings, injunctions, demands for discovery, even a bizarre temporary restraining order attempt claiming Elias's canoe posed a navigational hazard to Cassie's imagined future pleasure craft. Elias hired the only old-school lawyer in the county, Gus Milstein, whose office smelled of stale coffee and leather. Gus, who knew the history of every plot of land back to the 1800s, was incensed. "It's a nuisance suit, Elias, pure and simple," Gus grumbled, sifting through Cassie's thick documents. "They know the original deed is solid, but they're banking on you running out of money or patience. They're trying to force a settlement where you sell her the easement, or worse, the land itself." Elias, digging deep into his emergency savings, held firm. He wasn't fighting for money. He was fighting for principle and for the memory of his grandfather. The war escalated beyond legal paperwork. Cassie began hosting increasingly loud late-night parties, her way of using her property to annoy her neighbor. One night, a spotlight was installed shining directly toward Elias's bedroom window. Then came the physical obstructions. A week after Elias refused a lowball offer for the disputed zone, Cassie's men dumped 2 massive piles of gravel, supposedly for her future driveway, just inches from the survey line, effectively blocking Elias's access to the farthest corner of his own pond. "She's testing me, Gus," Elias told his lawyer. "She wants a reaction. She wants me to cross the line so she can sue me for assault or trespassing. Don't give it to her," Gus warned. "Let her play her ridiculous games. We file the counter motion next week." But Cassie wasn't interested in waiting for bureaucracy. She was a woman used to instantaneous results. Her frustration mounted. The counter motion was a legal setback, reinforcing Elias's ownership. The gravel hadn't stopped him. He was simply working around it. She needed a decisive physical statement. She needed to show Elias that she could access any part of the pond she wanted, whenever she wanted, regardless of his old, dusty deed. The day the final escalation occurred began deceptively still, with a heavy mist rising off the pond, making the world feel small and contained. Elias was out early, removing a large dead branch that had fallen into the water. He was balanced on the pond's northern bank, near the old willow, the very spot Cassie claimed. He knew this section was dangerously soft. The willow roots held the clay together, but the spring runoff had been aggressive, undermining the edge. Just as he dragged the branch free, a new sound cut through the morning silence. The distinctive, throaty growl of the BMW X7, accelerating too quickly. Cassie had driven it herself, bypassing the main house and tearing across the damp, recently graded field. She wasn't bringing lawyers or surveyors. She was bringing pure, unchecked arrogance. She stopped the heavy SUV dead center, aligning the massive gleaming hood with the exact spot where the surveyor's stake had been driven. The front tires of the BMW were now resting just barely on the bank's rim, the soft, undercut earth that Elias had, just minutes before, been warning about. She rolled the window down, her expression a mask of cold triumph. "Mr. Thorne!" she shouted over the idling engine, the sound vibrating the water. "I just wanted to prove a point to you. The deed is meaningless. I can access this feature from any angle I choose. If you won't sell, I'll simply build my path right here." Elias dropped the branch he was holding, the splash echoing loudly. He moved away from the water, his body tense. "Cassandra, you need to turn the car off and back away immediately. That bank won't hold the weight of that vehicle. It's been undercut by the spring. It's a soft spot." Cassie laughed, a short, brittle sound that offered no humor. "Please. I was told these banks were structurally sound. Besides, it's a BMW. It has all-wheel drive. Mr. Thorne, it can drive out of anything. She pressed the accelerator for emphasis, a sharp, pointless rev. The wheels spun once, biting into the damp clay, then stopped. "See?" she taunted, her voice thick with condescension. "Nothing is going to happen. Now I suggest you get your things and leave this part of my view." Elias took 2 more steps back, knowing in that moment that no amount of rational pleading would reach her. The universe, he thought grimly, was about to provide its own, far more persuasive argument. He watched her, a silent witness to the immediate, brutal consequence of her entitlement, the heavy mass of the X7, combined with the sudden torque of the engine rev, was the tipping point. The clay bank, already compromised, didn't sink gracefully. It sheared. A deep, sickening crack tore through the ground, a sound like a pistol shot amplified. The earth. The world had suddenly become very small, contained within the echo of the crushing, shearing clay and the thick, gurgling sound of a luxury machine drowning. Cassie Vance didn't even realize she was screaming until the water, cold and smelling of iron and ancient mud, splashed across her face. Panic was a raw, physical force. She fumbled with the door handle, but the pressure of the pond water surging into the cabin was too great. The automatic windows had locked. Her elegant white trousers were already soaked, and the expensive leather interior was rapidly becoming a fetid aquarium. Elias watched from 10 feet back, his body coiled, ready to act if she was trapped, but knowing instinctively she wasn't truly in danger, only in profound, humiliating shock with a desperate, animalistic grunt. Cassie managed to kick the door open just enough for the water to rush in, equalizing the pressure. She scrambled out, dragging herself across the submerged driver's seat and onto the tilted hood. She was hyperventilating, her tailored shirt clinging to her, her linen trousers ruined, and the silk scarf she wore now dark and heavy with pond muck. She looked less like a corporate titan and more like a mud skipper abandoned on the bank. Elias finally moved, not toward her, but toward the phone in his pocket. He was calm, focused entirely on the facts. "Are you hurt, Cassandra?" he asked, his voice steady. She didn't answer. She staggered onto the precarious bank, dripping, shaking, and finally found her voice, a sound of pure, incandescent fury. "You stood there! You watched it happen!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, muddied hand at him. "You deliberately destabilized the bank! This is vandalism! This is sabotage! That car cost $100,000. Elias held up a hand, flat and dismissive. "I warned you repeatedly that the bank was soft and undercut by spring runoff. I specifically warned you 2 minutes ago. You ignored me, drove a 3-ton vehicle onto disputed ground, revved the engine, and triggered a collapse. You weren't stuck. You were sinking. Now, step back from the edge before you fall back in. I'm calling the county sheriff and then my lawyer. I am calling my lawyer first!" she hissed, stumbling back towards the dry field, pulling her expensive phone from her ruined portfolio. Her fury was quickly solidifying into a cold, calculated desire for retribution. She dialed Julian, her sleek, merciless attorney. "Julian, it's Cassie. You will not believe this," she began, her voice tight with controlled hysteria. "He let my car sink. Elias Thorne let my X7 sink into that repulsive pond. It's half submerged. Get out here now! Call the police and make sure they understand this is a criminal act of negligence and property damage." The first to arrive was Deputy Frank Harris, a local man with a mustache that looked like dried wheat and a deep, weary knowledge of all the petty feuds in the county. He took one look at the scene, the pristine white BMW, nose deep in the murky water like a giant, drowned albino hippopotamus, and then at the 2 figures, Cassie, shivering and radiating designer brand indignation in the middle of the field, and Elias, standing quietly by his rickety dock, utterly composed. "Morning, Elias," Frank said, pulling out a small notepad. "Quite a predicament you got here, Mrs. Vance." "This is not a predicament, Deputy." Cassie exploded, her hands slicing the air. "This is a crime scene. That man stood by while I suffered financial and emotional damage. He should be arrested for criminal negligence." Frank looked at the massive rut marks leading directly from Cassie's property line to the shear point. "Ma'am, based on the tread marks and the angle of repose here, looks like you drove about 20 feet over your property line and put the front wheels right where that bank gave way." That area is disputed, Cassie countered, stamping her foot, sending a spray of mud into the air. My survey shows that portion belongs to my riparian rights. Well, right now your car is in Elias Thorne's pond, Frank observed dryly. And from what I gather, he was just pulling a branch out of his pond when you showed up. Just as the argument reached an impasse, two more cars arrived. First, the old, rusty Chevy of Elias's lawyer, Gus Milstein, and then a highly polished black Mercedes driven by Julian Vance, no relation to Cassie, but equally cold. Julian stepped out, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, taking in the scene with the eye of a vulture spotting carrion. The sight of the submerged X7 made his face go momentarily pale, not from shock, but from the realization of the complexity of the coming lawsuit. Julian marched straight to Elias, bypassing the deputy entirely. Thorne, this is a flagrant act of trespass, reckless endangerment, and clearly malicious mischief. You knew the condition of that bank. You failed in your duty to warn my client about a known hazard on property adjacent to her intended ingress. Gus, lighting an ancient, foul-smelling pipe, ambled up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Elias. Ingress, Julian? She drove a 5,000-pound vehicle 20 feet across a soft, unmarked field and tried to use a naturally eroding bank as a parking spot. Where's the warning sign on your client's driver's license that says, "Warning, do not drive into bodies of water"? And as for trespass, the car is currently sitting in a pond on land deeded to Mr. Thorne. Her trespass is literally submerged. The verbal sparring was interrupted by the arrival of a huge, muddy tow truck from the nearest major town, followed by a representative from Cassie's insurance company, a young woman in a blazer named Sarah, who looked utterly overwhelmed. The focus shifted from legal theatrics to engineering nightmare. The tow truck driver, a grizzled man named Roy, surveyed the scene with a professional, cynical eye. "No chance," he declared after a moment, shaking his head. "That bank won't hold the weight of my rig, not with the leverage needed to pull that much weight out of the mud suction. We try to pull that X7 straight, the bank collapses further and the vehicle goes all the way in." Julian stepped in, phone pressed to his ear, his voice clipped. "We need a crane. A heavy-duty recovery unit. Do whatever it takes, Mr. Roy. This is an urgent environmental matter. Fluids are leaking." This was Julian's new weapon, the immediate devastating escalation. Elias's head snapped up. "Leaking?" Sarah, the insurance rep, confirmed it with a grimace. "Yes, sir. We've spotted a light sheen of oil and some coolant coming from the radiator area. Given the angle and the fact the engine compartment is underwater, it's inevitable." "See, Thorne?" Julian hissed, gesturing dramatically at the faint rainbow shimmer on the water's surface, just beginning to drift away from the hood. "Now you are liable. This is your property, your water source, and your environmental negligence. We are filing an emergency motion for cleanup and remediation, and the cost will be exponential. You are obstructing the removal of a hazardous contaminant." The irony was crushing. Cassie had been trying to claim 25 feet of the pond bank to clean up the stagnant water, and now her own recklessness had turned the pond into a legal hazard for Elias. Elias felt the adrenaline spike, replacing his calm with righteous fury. He looked at Julian, then at Cassie, whose face was a mixture of triumph and vindictive satisfaction. "You won't move that car until a certified environmental assessment is done," Elias stated firmly, looking at Deputy Harris. "If fluids are leaking, the only one causing environmental damage here is the owner of the vehicle who drove it into the water. My pond is a protected wetland. I will not allow a catastrophic pull that destroys the rest of the bank and dumps the rest of the engine fluids into the spring source. That car stays right where it is until a plan is drafted that protects the water." Deputy Harris nodded slowly. He didn't understand the legal jargon, but he understood common sense. "Mr. Vance, Mr. Thorne has a point. That vehicle is now a hazard on private property. We need the EPA or state environmental folks to sign off on the retrieval plan." He looked at Roy. "No heavy pulling, Roy. Not today." Roy, delighted to avoid a high-risk operation, shrugged. "Fine by me. That means that big old BMW is sleeping with the fishes tonight." Julian stared at the submerged car, then at Elias, his face tightening with murderous resolve. "You think you've won a small victory, Thorne? You just lost the war. We will have this entire property seized for environmental cleanup costs by the end of the week. You can live in your dilapidated shack, but you will not own this contaminated dirt. Cassie, wrapped in a blanket supplied by the insurance rep, walked right up to Elias, her eyes blazing with cold, unsettling determination. That BMW is sitting on your deeded land, Mr. Thorne. It is now your problem. I will see you lose everything you inherited to pay for the damage you failed to prevent. She turned and marched toward Julian's Mercedes. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows over the scene, the white BMW X7 remained where it was, a monumental, absurd paperweight half sunken in the pond's black water. It was no longer just a luxury vehicle. It was the ultimate legal weapon, stuck exactly on the land Elias had fought to protect. Elias walked down to the edge of the water and looked at the oil slick, already spreading. He knew Julian wasn't bluffing. This was no longer about a property line. This was about crippling debt and the environmental safety of his sanctuary. He pulled out his phone and called Gus. "Gus," he said, watching the BMW's taillights glow red faintly beneath the water. "We have a problem. She turned her car into a barrel of toxic waste, and she just dumped it on my property. What happens next?" Gus, on the phone, gravelly, and the air over Elias's pond felt heavy, metallic, and sick. The fading light of the afternoon did little to disguise the iridescent signature of oil spreading sluggishly across the water's surface, reflecting the tilted, pristine white chassis of the submerged BMW. Elias, fueled by a cold, desperate adrenaline, followed Gus's instructions precisely. He spent the next hour documenting the scene with the meticulous detail of a crime scene investigator. He took 20 photos of the oil slick from various angles, photos of the sheared earth, photos of the tread marks leading directly to the collapse, and close-ups of the BMW's license plate, still perfectly visible above the waterline. He even filled 3 clean glass jars with pond water, one from the center, one from the spill, and one from the spring inflow point, to establish a chain of evidence. By the time he got to Gus's office, the papers were already flying. Julian had wasted no time, filing an emergency injunction to seize Elias's property temporarily under the pretense of an immediate hazardous materials cleanup necessity. "He's fast." "I'll give him that," Gus grumbled, stabbing his pipe into a chipped ceramic ashtray. "But predictable. He wants a court-ordered lien on your home so he can control the cleanup, run up the bill, and force a sale. This whole thing hinges on whether that leak is catastrophic or just a scare tactic." The emergency hearing was set for the next morning. It was a brutal, quick affair in a small, stale courtroom. Julian, radiating clean-cut professional menace, presented his case with dramatic flair, using the environmental hazard as the new, superior weapon to the property line dispute. "Your Honor," Julian's voice was sharp and accusatory, "we have a catastrophic failure of a retaining bank on the defendant's property, resulting in a 3-ton luxury vehicle being submerged in a natural watershed. The vehicle is leaking engine oil, transmission fluid, and coolant. This is an ecological disaster. The defendant, Mr. Thorne, is actively obstructing the immediate, necessary remediation because he wishes to preserve evidence for a petty land dispute, potentially allowing a toxic plume to enter the municipal water table." He presented affidavits from a hastily hired, highly paid environmental consulting firm, complete with satellite images that misleadingly exaggerated the size of the oil slick. He painted Elias as an irresponsible, negligent landowner who prioritized revenge over public safety. Elias, dressed in a simple button-down shirt that looked threadbare next to Julian's couture suit, felt the weight of the court's judgment pressing down on him. Gus rose slowly, leaning heavily on the defense table. "With respect, Your Honor, counsel is using inflammatory language to mask 2 critical facts. Fact 1, the environmental contamination was caused by the plaintiff, Ms. Vance, when she trespassed a 5,000-pound vehicle onto the property and drove it into a clearly dangerous, naturally occurring soft spot. Fact 2, the plaintiff's cleanup efforts, specifically her demand for an immediate, heavy-duty winch retrieval, would cause exponentially more environmental damage than the contained seepage we see now." "Seepage?" Julian scoffed. "It's a toxic event, Your Honor. The defendant has already contaminated the evidence." My client has done nothing but attempt to mitigate the contamination caused by Miss Vance's reckless actions. Gus roared, the unexpected volume making the bailiff flinch. He has already photographed and sampled the water. The question before this court is not if the contaminant exists, but who is responsible for its removal and remediation. The owner of the toxic barrel, which is currently registered in Ms. Vance's name, or the victim whose property was used as a toxic disposal site. The judge, a weary woman who looked like she'd been presiding over property disputes for 30 years, leaned back. The immediate priority is the environment. I am ordering the State Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, to dispatch an investigator immediately to assess the threat. Pending their report, I will not order the seizure of Mr. Thorne's land. However, I am placing an environmental lien on the disputed zone until the car is removed and the water is certified clean. She paused, looking directly at Elias. Mr. Thorne, you have 3 days to cooperate fully with the DEP. If their report indicates a major, ongoing threat due to your obstruction, the cost of the cleanup will fall entirely to you. You are on the clock, counselors. Get that car out. The clock began ticking the moment the DEP inspector, a woman named Lena Rourke, arrived at the pond. Lena was sharp, efficient, and unimpressed by both the submerged BMW and Cassie, who had returned to the site with a fresh set of clothes and a renewed air of command. Cassie immediately attempted to take charge. Ms. Rourke, I need you to authorize a crane operation. The longer that vehicle sits there, the worse the financial and environmental damage is. Mr. Thorne is being obstructionist. Lena ignored Cassie, walking straight to Elias. Mr. Thorne, show me the water samples and your property markers. Elias quickly walked her through the scene. He showed her the pristine third sample taken upstream, the slight sheen on the surface, and the critical photos of the rut marks. Lena, equipped with a specialized water testing kit, took her own samples directly from the radiator area of the submerged vehicle. The good news, Mr. Thorne, Lena said quietly, checking her readouts, is that the depth and the mud are acting as a decent barrier. The initial impact likely jarred loose a few liters of oil and coolant, but the pressure and the mud are temporarily containing the bulk of the fluids in the submerged engine compartment. It's a localized, low-level event, for now. For now, Cassie repeated, jumping into the conversation. But what about the long term? That car is a ticking time bomb! The gaskets will fail! I am aware of standard automotive degradation, Ms. Vance, Lena replied curtly. She turned to Elias. The primary hazard here is the structural integrity of the pond bank. We cannot risk a standard pull. It would destabilize the entire bank and rupture the remaining fluid reservoirs in the car, creating a genuine catastrophe. The car must be drained in situ before retrieval. This was the opening Elias and Gus needed. Elias looked at Cassie and Julian, who had just arrived with a fresh subpoena in hand. Drained? How do you propose to drain a fluid reservoir that is 3 feet underwater without sending a diver down there? Julian jumped in, anticipating the answer. We can hire professional divers, but the cost will be extreme. And again, the sole responsibility of the landowner, Mr. Thorne, for failing to maintain a safe environment. Lena Rourke closed her testing kit with a decisive snap. No, the DEP will not authorize a dive team on a contested private property for a non-catastrophic event. The only safe way to drain that engine, given the containment, is to access the drain plugs from the engine bay or the underside of the car, which is underwater, Cassie cried, throwing her hands up in exasperation. It's an impasse. This just proves we need the immediate high-cost, court-ordered cleanup. Elias suddenly smiled, a slow, predatory expression that hadn't touched his face since he left the city. He looked directly at Julian, then at Gus, whose eyes were twinkling behind his smoke-filled spectacles. Elias stepped forward, pointing a firm finger at the car's partially submerged hood. The car must be drained from below. The car belongs to Ms. Vance, and the car is currently 3 feet deep in the mud and water of my pond, Elias said, his voice gaining a hard, commanding edge. Under State Environmental Code, Paragraph 401.A, the owner of a contaminant source is responsible for the safe and complete remediation of the source. Since the DEP insists the fluids must be drained before retrieval, and since the only way to safely drain the fluids is by gaining access to the underside of the vehicle, he let the thought hang in the tense silence. then delivered the blow. I am formally filing a counterclaim with the court right now. I demand that Ms. Vance personally fund and facilitate the draining of her vehicle from below, on my property, within 48 hours. Or I will petition the court to authorize me to hire a salvage company to lift the vehicle out without draining it and charge the full, catastrophic cleanup costs directly to Ms. Vance for the necessary environmental remediation caused by her obstruction and abandonment of toxic waste. Julian turned on Cassie, his face pale with fury. Cassie, he's right. It's an abandoned vehicle. If he moves it and the rest of the fluids leak, it's still your liability because he warned you. If you don't drain it, he'll sue you for the cost of environmental remediation because you abandoned it as toxic waste. Cassie stared at the BMW, then at Elias, who stood over the water, not looking triumphant, but utterly resolved. She had created an expensive, beautiful time bomb, and the only person who could defuse it was its owner, by finding a way to get under a submerged car. The irony was devastating. Cassie, what? How do I even get under it? Do I have to swim under my own car in that filth? Elias, calmly. That is precisely the question, Cassandra. You wanted to own my pond. Now you own a very expensive underwater maintenance problem. Your move. Julian looked from the DEP inspector to Gus, who was smiling, knowing they had successfully turned the environmental weapon back on its wielder. Julian pulled Cassie away, his voice hissing in her ear about liability waivers and safety suits. They had run out of time and options. That night, Elias looked out across the pond, now strangely quiet beneath the moonlight. The white BMW was a tombstone marquee. The next morning, the northern bank of the pond looked like a poorly planned, high-budget sci-fi movie set. Cassie Vance had met Elias's challenge with characteristic extravagance, hiring a specialized industrial cleaning and recovery crew from the state capitol. They were expensive, methodical, and entirely uninterested in the emotional drama unfolding between the two landowners. They brought a generator, temporary lighting rigs, sealed containment tanks, and most notably a custom-fitted bright orange dry suit for Cassie. The suit was necessary. The DEP authorization for the in-situ draining explicitly required the owner or owner's designated agent to supervise the access to the contaminant source, and Julian, unwilling to take the physical liability, had maneuvered Cassie into the lead role. Elias sat on his porch, drinking bitter coffee and watching the spectacle. Gus had advised him to maintain distance, simply documenting every move. The BMW was still there, the white paint now dull and streaked with pond scum, an anchor of shame. Cassie emerged from the crew's trailer, struggling into the clumsy, oversized suit. She was wearing her usual impeccable makeup, a ridiculous contrast to the bulbous helmet and thick rubber gloves. Julian hovered nearby, holding an umbrella over her head against the light drizzle, looking mortified. We have exactly 6 hours. Ms. Vance, the crew chief, a broad man named Ray, announced through a loudspeaker, his voice booming across the still water. We've rigged the siphon system. You just need to reach the oil pan and transmission drain bolts and attach these specialized vacuum plugs. Cassie stumbled toward the bank, the heavy boots of the dry suit sucking at the mud. She looked furious, humiliated, and utterly out of her element. She moved gingerly, treating the natural earth like it was a pit of vipers, eventually having to wade into the chest-deep water to get to the submerged hood of her car. The operation was agonizingly slow and messy. She had to feel around blindly in the murky, cold water, her gloved hands slipping on the smooth, mud-caked metal of the car's underside. The irony was a thick, palpable presence. The woman who hated the filth of the country was now elbow-deep in the sediment of the pond she had tried to eradicate. I can't feel the bolt! Where is the damn bolt? Cassie's voice, filtered through the helmet's microphone, sounded frantic and reedy. Julian, yelling instructions from the safety of the bank, was no help. It's 10 centimeters past the note. To your left! To your left, Cassandra! Don't damage the manifold! The tension reached a peak when she finally located the oil drain. The crew chief gave the signal, and the powerful vacuum system roared to life, sucking the heavy black fluid into a containment tank. The noise was deafening, the drama electric. Then, the true turning point came, caused by the very force that had sunk the car. As Cassie struggled to position the second siphon under the transmission pan, she leaned heavily against the collapsed piece of the bank. The water pressure shift caused by the vacuum, combined with the instability of the remaining clay ledge, triggered a secondary, smaller cave-in. A rush of water and mud surged around her, but more importantly, the movement dislodged a massive, irregular object from deep within the bank's structure, right where the willow's deepest roots had been. It wasn't a rock. It was a weathered piece of granite, impossibly large, covered in centuries of mud and clearly hewn. What was that? Cassie gasped, pushing the mud away from her faceplate. The crew chief, standing on the bank, was focused on the vacuum hoses. "Just more debris, Ms. Vance. Keep working!" But Cassie saw it. The object was dark, flat on one side, and exposed just beneath the surface of the cleared mud, right at the maximum line of her BMW's trespass. Instinctively, she reached out, her thick rubber gloves struggling to grip the slick, heavy surface. She realized what it was, an old-world boundary marker. Not a flimsy surveyor's stake, but a permanent, decades-old monument. She managed to clear enough mud to read the crude, deep chisel marks carved into the top. It read, TV 1952. Thorne Vance, marking the original, shared boundary between Elias's grandfather and the Vance ancestor who had owned Cassie's land back then. Crucially, the stone was positioned a full 8 feet inside the line Cassie's new, expensive survey claimed. Her BMW hadn't just trespassed. It had sunk almost 10 feet past the legally recognized boundary. A slow, chilling realization dawned on her, replacing her physical misery with cold, calculated panic. This stone was the indisputable physical evidence that would demolish her entire case. Julian's high-tech survey was either intentionally fraudulent or carelessly incompetent, but this stone, set in 1952 and now revealed by her own destructive actions, was the truth. In a moment of pure, blinding desperation, a reflex born of years of using money to erase inconvenient facts, Cassie did the unthinkable. Ignoring the pain in her back and the vacuum hose slipping in her hand, she leveraged her shoulder against the heavy granite marker, pushing it deeper into the soft underwater mud, covering the inscription with a fresh layer of sludge. She used her enormous, clumsy boot to kick loose debris over it, hoping to rebury the truth before anyone else saw it. She then frantically clamped the second siphon plug into place, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The crew chief confirmed the drainage. "Transmission cleared!" "Good job, Ms. Vance. That's the bulk of the hazard mitigated." Elias, watching from his porch through a pair of powerful binoculars, had seen the entire clumsy maneuver. He saw the granite, the inscription, and the desperate, hurried attempt to rebury it. He lowered the binoculars, his face a mask of shocked recognition, followed by cold, utter certainty. TV 1952. His grandfather had told him about the old, buried stone marker that defined the true line, a marker he thought had been lost years ago. He walked down to the bank, stopping just outside the perimeter tape. Cassie, pulling herself out of the water, was shivering violently, covered head to toe in a grotesque coating of black mud and green pond slime. She looked less like a corporate executive and more like a primordial swamp creature struggling to be born. "Congratulations, Cassandra," Elias said, his voice quiet, carrying over the hum of the pumps. "You completed the cleanup. You finally found the time to deal with the contamination you caused." Cassie ripped off her helmet, her hair plastered to her head, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. She glared at him, a flicker of something new, raw terror in her eyes. "Don't gloat, Thorne. This cost me $60,000. You will pay for every single penny of this remediation and the cost of the tow." "You reburied the boundary marker, Cassandra," Elias stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a flat, fatal pronouncement. "The TV 1952 granite monument. My grandfather placed it with your grandfather. It proves your survey is fraudulent and that your car sank 10 feet inside the legal line." Cassie's composure shattered. She looked from Elias to Julian, who was scrambling to get her a clean towel, then back to the opaque, dark water. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, the words trembling. "There was nothing there but mud and debris." Elias took a step toward the water's edge, pointing not at the sunken car, but at the patch of recently disturbed mud just beneath the surface. "I saw you push it down." "Cassandra," he said, his eyes drilling into hers. "And now, because you tried to destroy the only unambiguous physical proof of the property line, you've done more than commit trespass. You've committed obstruction of justice." He pulled out his phone, not to call his lawyer, but to dial the sheriff's office. "I need to report the attempted concealment of evidence related to a felony. I know exactly where that marker is. And now, the fight is over the land, the car, and the fact that you just tried to bury the truth in my pond." The moment Elias ended the call with the sheriff's dispatcher, the heavy atmosphere over the pond shifted from legal warfare to outright criminal entanglement. The pumps were silent now. The crew chief, Ray, and his team had ceased all operations upon hearing Elias's pronouncement. The BMW, drained but still stuck, remained a silent, glistening monument to hubris. Cassie Vance stood on the muddy bank, shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold of the pond water that had soaked her dry suit's seals, but from a deeper, colder fear. The threat of financial ruin was familiar. The threat of a felony charge was paralyzing. Julian, her attorney, understood the seismic shift instantly. He saw the genuine, unfeigned resolve in Elias's eyes and the indisputable physical reality of the evidence Cassie had tried to conceal. "You idiot!" Julian hissed, dragging Cassie further away from the drainage crew, his voice low and venomous. "You had a viable nuisance suit. We had him on the environmental lien. Why in God's name would you touch anything in the mud?" "I didn't see anything," Cassie whispered, her voice high-pitched and raw, desperately clinging to the lie even as her eyes darted toward the telltale patch of disturbed sludge. "Mr. Thorne saw you," Julian said flatly, pulling his phone out. "He has motive, means, and a sworn statement." "Obstruction of justice, destruction of property markers. That's not a civil suit, Cassandra. That's a booking." Julian didn't wait for the sheriff. He called his senior partner. His demeanor changed from aggressive lawyer to frantic damage controller. He had to sever his legal proximity to Cassie's criminal act immediately, or his own license was on the line. He delivered a hurried, clipped summary of the situation, the initial fraudulent survey, the bank collapse, and the final catastrophic act of concealment, before abruptly handing the phone to Cassie. "They're pulling my representation from the obstruction charge," he told her, his voice devoid of his usual polished cadence. "You are now facing this on your own. My firm will handle the civil claim against your fraudulent survey company, but you need a criminal defense attorney now. Do not say another word to anyone." The arrival of the sheriff's entourage was swift and decisive. Deputy Harris returned, this time with a uniformed detective and a county surveyor. The surveyor looked at the situation, the half-submerged X7, the containment tanks, the orange-suited, mud-covered executive, and the calm, dirt-caked landowner with utter bafflement. The detective, a sharp woman named Miller, approached Elias first. She heard his sworn testimony, cross-referencing it with the initial incident report detailing the property dispute. Elias was direct, simply pointing out the spot. "It's right there, Detective," Elias said, pointing to the disturbed patch. She dug it up during the draining, realized it was the original TV 1952 marker, and kicked it back under. "It's a granite block, buried deep, but currently sitting beneath the mud suction created by her car." Detective Miller turned to Cassie, who was now being held by Julian's protective arm, weeping silently beneath the protection of the perimeter tape. "Ms. Vance," Detective Miller's voice was calm but held an undeniable weight of authority. "Mr. Thorne has sworn that you tampered with a boundary marker while performing court-ordered environmental mitigation. Do you have anything to say before we begin excavation?" Cassie, choked on her fear, could only shake her head violently. Julian stepped forward, his face pale. "My client asserts her Fifth Amendment right and will make no statement at this time." The county surveyor, a meticulous man named Mr. Doyle, was dispatched immediately. He brought specialized sonic detection gear used for locating buried utility lines and septic tanks. The presence of the huge metal BMW complicated the readings, but Elias's detailed description of the location was accurate. Ray, the cleanup crew chief, was given instructions to temporarily use his siphon to clear a small patch of mud. The tense silence, broken only by the sucking sound of the mud pump, was agonizing. Then Mr. Doyle let out a low whistle. "It's here, Detective. Large piece of granite. Feels like it's resting on bedrock." The crew, now working under the sheriff's direction, carefully used hand tools to clear the dense, viscous mud. Minutes later, the granite marker was fully exposed, lying horizontally in the trench created by the BMW's initial impact. It was exactly where Elias said it was. The ancient, crude chisel marks, though slick with pond water, were clear and unmistakable. TV 1952. Mr. Doyle quickly took measurements using a laser rangefinder. His movements were slow, deliberate, and final. He confirmed the coordinates, checking them against the historical county records that Gus Milstein had supplied. "Detective," Mr. Doyle announced, his voice echoing the definitive, non-negotiable tone of empirical data. "The 1952 marker confirms the Thorne property line is located 8 feet beyond the claimed boundary of the Vance survey. The submerged BMW X7 is resting approximately 10 feet inside Mr. Thorne's legally deeded property." The revelation was devastating. The BMW hadn't just accidentally gone slightly over the line. The entire basis of Cassie's lawsuit, her expensive self-serving survey, was proven to be radically, fundamentally false, if not outright fraudulent. Her entire hostile takeover attempt was built on a lie that her own vehicle had tragically unburied. Detective Miller immediately moved toward Cassie. "Ms. Vance, you are being detained pending a formal statement regarding the concealment of material evidence in a land dispute." Cassie didn't resist. She was stripped of her dignity, her financial power, and now her freedom. As Deputy Harris placed her under a temporary detention, Cassie looked at Elias one last time, her eyes burning not with anger but with the cold, hollow realization that her wealth could not buy off geology or human observation. With the property line firmly re-established and Cassie detained, the legal landscape flipped violently. Julian immediately began negotiations not to sue Elias, but to settle the civil matter before the sheriff's investigation into the fraudulent survey involved his firm. Within 24 hours, the final terms were dictated entirely by Elias and Gus. First, the civil claim against Elias for the cleanup was dropped entirely. Second, Cassie's insurance company was forced to contract a specialized high-lift crane operation, a soft tow, to retrieve the now drained BMW under Elias's strict environmental supervision. The costs for the recovery, the remediation, and the extensive bank restoration were placed squarely and irrevocably on Cassie Vance. Elias, as the victim of trespass and attempted obstruction, was even paid a substantial fee for the loss of enjoyment of his property during the 2 weeks of chaos. The tow itself was the final defining image. The giant crane arrived the next day, a magnificent machine of steel and counterweights. It lowered its rigging, carefully secured by the crew, and with a slow, powerful groan, the BMW X7 was pulled inch by painful inch from the sucking grip of the pond. It emerged a wreck, mud-caked. Bruised, the glass cracked from the pressure of the sink. The interior ruined by water damage, and the exterior bearing the scars of the clay bank's fatal embrace. It was towed away not as a luxury vehicle, but as a total loss, a contaminated, ruined object that symbolized the utter failure of its owner's hubris. As the crane packed up and the sun began to set, Elias and Gus stood on the newly reinforced bank. The water was once again quiet, the oil slick gone, the air tasting of clean, damp earth. The old stone marker, TV 1952, was now placed prominently, permanently cemented exactly where it was found, serving as an immovable declaration of Elias's ownership. "You won, Elias," Gus said, knocking his pipe against the marker. "You won the land, you won the lawsuit, and you exposed the corruption. You just fought a multi-million-dollar corporation and their lawyer with nothing but a muddy bank and the truth." Elias looked out over the pond, watching a great blue heron land softly on the restored dock. He didn't feel triumphant, only profoundly, deeply tired, and finally safe. "No, Gus," Elias corrected him, smiling faintly. I didn't win. The pond won. It just used me to collect the debt. He turned and walked back toward his house, leaving the sanctuary to its ancient, undisturbed peace. The last light of the day caught the surface of the water, reflecting the sky, utterly still, as if the dramatic reckoning had never happened at all.